Heavy Artillery of Duststorm Eugene is the retire strategy of Dragon Empire. This deck heavily focuses on retiring the opponent's field, but with a twist, as this variant relies on the soul for a big payout, as Eugene can summon a new field out of nowhere. You never know what lies beyond the next doom. Heavy Artillery Duststorm Eugene isn't your typical boss unit. Unlike most boss units, he doesn't have a big flashy play. He's a Vanguard that generates value turn after turn and mainly relies on his rearguards to do the heavy lifting for him, while he is the main supporter around them. This is best seen in Eugene's ability, as Eugene's first ability allows him to rest 2 of his own rearguards to retire one of our opponent's units, while he also gains 10k power. This is great for basically free retires turn after turn, as you don't really lose out on resources, as it doesn't cost Counterblast and Soul Blast. And there are many units within this archetype that interacts with them being rested on the field. Eugene's second ability allows him to benefit from all the retire options that Dragon Empire has access to, as for the cost of 5 soul, he can look at the top card of the deck equal to the amount of open slots on your opponent's field and then call those units to the field. But he can also opt to choose any of those units and put them back into the soul. This is a great way to build a new field out of nowhere, while at the same time just put cards into the soul that you don't really have room on the board, or you don't have any desire to call them to the field. This ability can be used in 2 different ways, as you can use this as an aggressive tool to just flood the board and be aggressive right at the get-kill and keep pressuring your opponent with attacks, or you can use this skill as a more defensive, reactive ability, as when your opponent is destroying your resource and you don't really have any more cards left to dedicate on the board, you can use this ability to still be able to generate cards onto the field, and it can then be seen as a plus engine instead of just an aggressive tool. Now, with the latest support wave for Eugene, we've got some really nice upgrades to the main deck, as one of those cards being Strong Fortress Dragon Gibar Brachio. This is a great card that synergizes with Eugene's main effects, as this is another card that allows you to retire one of your opponent's units, only this time it costs a soul instead of Counterblast, which is great because we generate a lot of soul with the engine. But on top of it, it can potentially restand itself, thus being another great target for Eugene's rest ability if you don't need the inherent retire option of Gibar Brachio himself. So this card can be used very flexible and at the same time can generate solid numbers, as it's once again another potential 15k attacker, which Eugene now has plenty of options to. Another new addition to the deck is the Great One Drag Raider Idrius. This is another card which basically is an upgrade to Nigel, as it's once again a card that can make a 1-for-1 trade with your opponent while it's rested thanks to Eugene. But on top of it, it also has the option to just give it a 10k increase. Yes, it's a 5k base, but if you give him the 10k power increase, it becomes a solid 15k attacker or booster that can make a solid 28k column with any 13k grade free. And as seen as it goes into the soul instead of being retired like Nigel, it also fuels for your other soul blasting costs like Gibar Brachio or maybe Eugene himself. Another nice retire option is Stealth Dragon Kizan Renji. This is just a generic retire option that costs a Counterblast and a Soul Blast. The only restriction to this one, it needs to retire something in the column. Now, the great thing about this particular card is that it does allow you to activate your other main phase abilities like Idrius, as it's a retire during the main phase that doesn't rely on Eugene's effect that needs to retire 2 units. So if you don't want to use Eugene's ability for some reason, or you maybe can't, then this is another way to still be able to facilitate this. So a good example for the situation where this might come up is that, let's say you have no cards left in hand, you top deck this card, you cannot use Eugene because you have no cards on the field, but you can use this effect to retire something on your opponent's side of the field, and then you can use Eugene's Soul Blast 5 ability if you have the remaining soul left for it, and then you can call a new field to the board. Now, another excellent support card for Eugene, which capitalizes on the fact that you can retire your opponent's field, is Penetrate Dragon Tribash. This card allows us to give our Eugene potentially the extra critical, thus giving more pressure onto the board. And it goes into the soul, which then fuels our variant soul blasting skills. And as seen as Eugene is probably our biggest attack makes him getting the critical the best type of value we could generate with it. And this is also a great card that can combo with Idris, as it is one of those cards that can generate a 28k column if we use the extra 10k power increase. Now the last card that I want to highlight is Dragon Monk Gojo. This is originally the countercharge engine for Dragon Link Overlord, but as seen as generic, it does work in Eugene, and it does work in Eugene quite nicely because Eugene is typically our strongest attack, and that by default gives our opponent the incentive to no guard the attack, as it will waste most shield value if they're gonna hard guard against it if they don't have a PG in hand. But by putting a Gojo behind this, they basically are forced in a position where they need to guard against our strongest attack instead of our weakest attack to not give us the counter charge, which can generate even more retires in the long run. So this is a nice option to not only refund the counterblast cost, but also put more pressure behind our Eugene if we cannot put a Tri-Bash on the board, which does somewhat the same thing with the inherent critical. Now, like most cases, the right line for Eugene is basically the Eugene right line itself. There is no real benefit in running any of the other cards because we just generate what we exactly need. The grade 1 gives us 1 soul and the grade 2 gives us another soul plus a draw, which is great. And if we add that all together, that means we have exactly 5 soul the moment we write Eugene. So if we want to capitalize on this, we can basically call nothing in the early game, retire our opponent's board as much as we can, or if they didn't call anything, we can use Eugene soul plus 5 to get an entire board for free and keep all the cards from the early game in our hand for just guard potential. That's one way how we can utilize this, or that soul that we generate in the early game can be fuel for cards like Gibar Brachio or Kizan Reiji to just retire more stuff over the long course of the game. For Eugene, the triggers are very much fixed to some extent because fronts aren't that great because you typically will attack with one of your rear guards first if you have a Tri-Bash on the board because that one goes to the soul. The only situation where you will attack first with Eugene is if you put the Tri-Bash on the back row, but that means you're sacrificing your boosters, or if you don't even have a Tri-Bash at all. So if you play with Tri-Bash in mind, you probably will go for something like 4 heals, 8 to 7 crits, and then 3 to 4 draws plus the over trigger. Now if you do want to run the fronts, I do advise you to replace them with the criticals because the draws are still very important for the deck because Eugene does lack draw power to some extent. Yes, Eugene's Soul plus 5 ability is a plus engine to some extent, but you cannot guarantee the value and they do not go to your hand, so you lose any potential triggers that you see in the top 5 or top X cards of your deck. And that does bring us to the deck list for this video. And for this video, I want to present this particular deck list. Now, there are 2 cards in this list that we haven't discussed so far. One of those being Stealth Rogue of Iron Blade Ushikuni. This is effectively just another 15k beater that we have access to, just like the potential of Gibar Brachio. Its condition is usually not that hard to fulfill because with all the retire options we have available, we can snipe a lot of cards from our opponent's side of the field. And usually on the very first grade 3 turn, they will have hardly anything on the field, so it's immediately a 15k attacker. Now as for the other card, we have the Blitz Order Burn Bright Pure Prayers. This is yet another card that gives us a bit more shield value because as stated, draw power is somewhat limited. So I want to make every single card count as much, and if I can guard most attacks with just 1 card, that saves us a lot of trouble in the end. And yes, it can come up in a situation where it's in the top X cards of the deck with Eugene, but I can just put it into the soul to fuel for other skills at that stage. Now as for the rest of the deck is basically very straightforward. You want to retire as much of your opponent's side of the field as consistently as possible, and we can utilize the Eugene cards, which is Eugene himself. Gibar Brachio is a nice option. Idrius as well as Kizan Reiji are another option to do this turn after turn after turn. Now the ideal thing that you want to do is set up for your Gibar Brachio where this card can stand himself so you can still apply a lot of pressure. You have the option to use its own ability if you need to retire more units on the field to fulfill its condition, but if you don't have to do that, I advise to rest him with Eugene himself, because if you have 2 Gibar Brachios on the front row, you can rest them both and they will restand themselves and they will then be 15k attackers, which is actually really nice to generate free value out of nowhere. Now another thing that we can take a look at is Idrius, his own effect, because one thing we haven't touched upon is that Idrius' effect isn't once per turn. So if we go for the 10k power increase, we could use that multiple times if we wish to increase our numbers even further. So if we know we're in a last turn situation and we just want to pressure or push as hard as possible and we have a couple of counterblast face up, we can use that skill a couple of times to make him into a 25-35k booster or attacker to still pressure opponent for big numbers on our last attack turn. And the final remark that I want to give about this deck, and I've said it before in this video, is that use Eugene's Soul Blast 5 skill very wisely. You don't have to rely on it every single turn, and you don't have to use it as an aggressive tool. It can also be used defensively, because in this particular list, I mainly use it as a fail-safe button because I want to use my soul mainly for cards like Gibar Rakio and Kinzan Reiji, because they can give me more value in the long run if I can keep sniping my opponent's rear guards and then still apply the restance and still be able to push out free attacks with decent numbers behind them. Because you can use Eugene's Soul Blast 5 ability and then look at the top 5 cards of your deck and see 4 triggers in the over trigger, and then basically you wasted a lot of resources and cards for absolutely nothing at that point. Now, in terms of tech options, there are actually a lot of different things that you can do with Eugene, even though the deck is relatively the same in just the core aspects. Because we have multiple 15k beaters to work with, one of those cards being Phosmo, Faggy, Dragon, Hungersaurus, which is basically always going to be a 15k beater no matter what situation, which can be nice because some of the other cards can be stuck as a 10k beater and then they absolutely do nothing, whereas this at least is a 15k beater. Yes, you maybe need to hit into a rearguard sometimes, but at the very least, unlike the 10k beaters at that point, it can hit into a grade 3, and if it hits into a grade 2, it still forces your opponent to waste more shield if they want to keep that card onto the board. So you can potentially replace Ushikuni with Hungersaurus if you like that play a bit more. And you might sometimes have a situation where Hungersaurus can attack into the Vanguard and is a 15k beater, whereas Ushikuni isn't. Because if, for example, your opponent has called the entire back row, Ushikuni is just a 10k beater, which doesn't really do anything if you cannot retire more, whereas Hungersaurus is a 15k attacker at that stage. Another option that you can play into your grade 1 lineup is Stealth Fiend Shigamanago. This is basically another way to generate more value off of your Eugene rest ability, because you can use her as a target for your rest, then retire her, and then get a new card onto the board. This is basically to save cards from hand while still putting more numbers on your columns. Yes, you can accidentally call a trigger, but a trigger behind a new unit is still 5k extra power that can overcome a threshold for a magic number, whereas a rested grade 1 does absolutely nothing at that point. But I think the most interesting tech choice that you can add to your deck, which does changes the dynamic of your playstyle quite a bit, is the grade 2 Blaze Maiden Tanya. So this card has 2 different impacts on the deck. In the late game, you can potentially call this off of Eugene to then call another grade 0 from your drop zone onto the field, thus populating the board more if you don't have enough cards on the field to have an entire board filled. And it's also a great card that you can potentially top deck in the late game, because if you have nothing on the board and you top deck this card, you can call her, then use her ability to call a grade 0, then you can rest those 2 cards with Eugene to snipe something on your opponent's field, and then if you have the Soul Blast left, you can use the Soul Blast 5 to call an entire new board, which this card allows you to do in those sticky situations. But I think the most interesting approach of this card is that it allows you to change your early game into heavy aggro options. Because if you have this card by turn 2, you can place her onto the field, you can resurrect a trigger that you maybe have discarded for the right deck or maybe guarded in the early game, call it onto the field, and you can then go for 2 different routes. You can go wide and have 3 10k attacks, as she is a 10k attacker, your Vanguard is a 10k attacker, and that trigger will also become a 10k attacker, which is nice for just general pressure. But if you're afraid of a potential defensive trigger, you can also go big and just make a 20k column, which is also nice to just hit for 2 good numbers. And this also makes Dragonmon Gojo a lot better in the early game, because now you can use Gojo as a Vanguard booster on that turn 2 play and potentially refund the cost of that counterblast that you use for Tanya. So Tanya does open up different lines of play for the deck, so if you want to go for that, you can potentially replace Ushikuni with her, or you can just replace the Burn Bright Pure Prayers for her if you want to go that particular route. And that concludes the deck spotlight for Eugene. Now overall, Eugene is a relatively simple deck to pilot because there isn't a lot of interactions that happen within the deck. But that said, to actually pilot this deck effectively, you need to learn all the different matchups and know what type of cards you need to prioritize with retiring and know when and how much cards you should dedicate to the board. That's what's going to differentiate being a good Eugene player versus a bad Eugene player. And it just takes a lot of time to actually master the deck. And as we're already seeing with the new reveals on set 3, Eugene is going to get some spicy new cards, which definitely can power up this strategy. So if you're interested in this strategy, then this is probably the best time to start practicing, to understand the deck, to understand the intricate plays and combos that are available to Eugene, to then be prepared for once set 3 drops in the English format. With it said, let me know in the comments down below what you guys think of Eugene as well as this deck spotlight. I'm very curious what your opinion is about this strategy, but with that all said, I want to give a huge shout out to my Patreon supporters over at patreon.com/VanguardInsider. You guys are amazing. If you want to support the channel or everything that's happening on the channel, you can simply go to patreon.com/VanguardInsider and become a patron today. But with that said, I've been Mr. Time Leap, and I see you guys in the next one!